Good morning. Can everyone hear me in the back? Okay. Welcome to the Atlantic Council. My name is William Wexler. I lead the Middle East programs here at the Council. Thank you very much for joining us all today as we publicly launch a timely brief written by one of our senior fellows, Nader Uskowi, called The Evolving Iranian Strategy in Syria, a Looming Conflict with Israel. His brief is available on our website, and copies are available outside this room. Hopefully you all have one. In a few moments, we'll hear from a panel of experts who bring unique perspectives to the set of critical issues for U.S. regional policy. As you all doubt know, that as the Syrian civil war enters at one level a final stage, but another level a whole new era of uncertainty, competition from regional actors are playing an even greater role, perhaps, in shaping the future outcomes than they did before. As Nader highlights in his issue brief, Iran, Israel, as well as other states, including the US, Russia, and Turkey, all have long-term and sometimes contradictory strategic objectives for Syria. This is, setting the stage for certainly disagreements and perhaps future conflicts to come. And of course, fire has already been exchanged between Israel and Iran on these issues. I don't think anybody expects that to be the last. Here at the Atlantic Council, we've covered the crisis in Syria for a very long time through a long range of analytical lenses and perspectives. Recently, the Rafik Hariri Center published an issue brief by our senior fellow, Faisal Atani, and the new American International Security Fellow, Nate Rosenblatt, entitled U.S. Policy in Syria, A 7-Year Reckoning. I encourage you all to read that as well. It examines U.S. policy decisions or lack of decisions in Syria over this period of time and how they helped shape the outcomes. Please also look at our Syria Source blog, which is dedicated to looking at this conflict and all the different aspects of it. As an organization, we view our Syria work as part of our broader mission to cooperate with partners and allies to meet global challenges. We hope that by bringing this panel together, we can discuss not only the potential for conflict between Iran and Israel and Syria, but also desirable end states that promote stability and security. Throughout this event and after, please remember to follow the discussion on Twitter at #ACMidEast. And now I'd like to invite our panelists on stage to kick off our discussion. Please. Can everyone still hear me with the mic? Yeah? Okay. Before I turn to them each in turn, let me give you a quick introduction of who you're going to hear from. Nader Uskowi is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, immediately to my left. He is the author of the brief that is coming out today that I mentioned. He's also the president of Sagewood Consulting, which specializes in Iran, the Middle East, and Central Asia. And most importantly, he has a book coming out in November or December. Okay. Called Temperature Rising, Iran, Revolutionary Guards, and Wars in the Middle East. If you go on Amazon right now, you can already buy it. So I know I'm really looking forward to reading it. From 2013 to 2017, he worked at the Pentagon, serving as a senior policy advisor to the U.S. Central Command. He began his professional life as a journalist in Iran, and in 1978 became the country's youngest editor of a major daily newspaper. He holds a BA from the University of Southern California and an MA from George Washington University. Please, everyone, join me in thanking Nader for his work on this brief and his presence here today. After we hear from Nader, we will then hear from Jennifer Caffarella. She is Director of Intelligence Planning at the Institute for the Study of War. She has written extensively on the Syrian war, including detailed analysis of al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. Her essay has been published by Foreign Affairs and a number of other outlets. She's a graduate of ISW's Hertog War Studies program and was ISW's first Evans Hansen Fellow. She received her BA from the University of Minnesota Twin Cities in Global Studies with a focus on the Middle East and is proficient in Arabic. Thank you very much for joining us here as well, Jennifer. I'm pleased also to have Brigadier General Asaf Orion. He is temporarily a military fellow at the Washington Institute. He's a retired Brigadier General and defense strategist. He was responsible for strategic policy formulation, international cooperation, and military diplomacy. He's most recently the head of strategic division in the planning directorate of the IDF General Staff. After retiring from the IDF in 2016, he joined the Institute for National Security Studies, INSS, in Tel Aviv. And he owns a bachelor's degree in Arabic language and literature from the Middle Eastern history from Tel Aviv University and a master's degree from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Thank you very much, Asaf, for joining us. We're going to start here by hearing from each one of them in turn, and then we want this to be a discussion amongst all of us as much, so please, as you're hearing them, think of your questions. I will call each of you in turn as I see you. If you don't have any questions, you may risk me calling on you anyway. So please pay attention and think of good questions. Please.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and good morning to you all. Short time, complex subject, so let's get right to it. Iran's objectives in Syria began at the outset of the civil war. Iran's main objectives were defeating the Sunni extremists and saving Assad. In December 2016, those objectives pretty much were accomplished. After the victory of the Iran-led forces in Battle of Aleppo, Assad was saved, and the Sunni moderate Sunni opposition were virtually defeated. Iran could have easily left Syria at the time, but it had other intentions. From the very first days of the revolution, especially for those of us who covered that revolution, the Iranians had a very clear regional goals, that the revolution was not just about Iran. Revolution was also about creating a Shia arc of influence, which now extends from Western Afghanistan to Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and the Mediterranean. Not a highway, although that too, but more a linkage of the Shia communities linked together geographically and ideologically under the leadership of the Islamic Republic, and that's the last part is the key. Syria was the missing link in that arc of influence. The second objective for Iran to stay on beyond its immediate objective in Syria was again another goal that the revolution had from the very beginning, and that was that Islamic Republic wanted to challenge Israel and eventually put an end to the state of Israel, the stated goal. Syria gave Iran a chance to start a second front against Israel. And to do so, Iranian needed to lease major parts of many Syrian military bases to house the Quds Force, IRGC officers, including general officers, to house their command and control and intelligence centers, to house, most importantly, their ballistic missile units inside Syria, and finally to house tens of thousands of Shia militias under their command in those bases. Shia militias including Lebanese Hezbollah, including Pakistani and Afghan militants, and including some Iraqi Shia militias. The objectives were to restrict the Israeli freedom of movement in the area, to challenge Israel militarily at their front lines in Golan, and acting as a deterrence, if you will, against any possible Israeli attacks on Iran. So, the change in a strategy. Those of you who have followed Iran, many of you have followed Iran very closely. The Iranian military for the longest time operated under the doctrine of asymmetric proxy warfare, which included avoiding a direct military direct military conflict with a superior military force on foreign land. The new strategy in Syria of remaining in the country, of keeping the ballistic missiles, of building permanent bases, of keeping UAV runways and UAV facilities, of keeping the Shia militias, and keeping a significant number of IRGC-Quds Force officers, including general officers, and house them in those permanent bases, of course exposed them to the Israeli attacks and ran counter to that strategy that Iran had for long advocated and followed. Now, the aftermath of those strategy. Let me know. The aftermath of the new strategy. In February of this year, the IRGC and IRGC drone, armed with offensive weapons, missiles, was launched at from one of those Iranian bases toward Israel and actually crossed the Israeli airspace. Something Iran had never done before. Israel retaliated by destroying that UAV facility in that military base, which was the first indication of the dangers inherited in the newest Iranian strategy of directly challenging Israel from Syrian soil. On May 10th of this year, the Quds Force, in retaliation of that Israeli action, broke decades of military strategy of using proxies and avoiding direct conflict with the superior military force on foreign land, and launched 40+ rockets from an Iranian base in Syria toward the Israeli front position in Golan. The attack was unsuccessful. The few rockets that reached Golan was intercepted by Israeli anti-missile systems. But within hours, Israeli air and missile forces attacked nearly all of Iranian facilities in Syria, more than a couple of dozen of that. Iranians were caught, and the targets were the command and control centers, UAV centers, housings, and all the facilities that Iranians had. The Iranians were caught unprepared, under-equipped to defend the bases or to launch immediate counterattacks. That defeat, the defeat suffered by the Quds Force on May 10th, naturally caused a moment for sense-making for the Iranian leadership. What do we do in Syria? Do we remain in Syria or not? Do we continue challenging Israel in Syria or not? This Sunday, after 5 months since that May 10th defeat, the IRGC spokesman told Press TV that the Quds Force-led forces indeed will remain in Syria and will challenge Israel to prevent it from, quote, establishing safe zone inside Syria and, quote, stopping it from partitioning Syria, unquote. This is this Sunday. So they have made that decision. They are going to stay. Israel wants them out. The two sides on a trajectory of a military conflict if something does not give. There are, of course, two major constraints for Iranians that might prevent them to implement this strategy. The first one is the geopolitics of the Syrian conflict. There are 5 national armies involved in fighting in Syria, Syrian army, Russians, Turks, the US, and Iranians, 5 armies. And then there is a 6th army, Israeli army, which is involved in a war within a war, kind of a conflict with the Iranians on Syrian soil. So when you have all these armies in such a small place fighting, and each have their own goals, you have extreme complexity of that theater, and that complexity could slow down could affect Iran's decision to stay in Syria for long. We get to that more in the discussion. The second constraint is the dire state of Iranian economy and politics. Skyrocketing prices, high inflation, and recession all at the same time. On top of it, economic sanctions, including the major sanction announced yesterday by the Treasury, and the oil and banking sanctions coming up on November 4th, November 4th. Also, the political challenges. Iran has seen a wave of demonstrations and national strikes directly against the regime, calling the ability of the regime to resolve Iranian problem. So between these two constraints, on one hand, Iran has an ideological affinity, ideological principle of keeping the revolution not just for Iran but for the region, and for that reason to keep their forces in Syria, to keep the arc of influence, Shia arc of influences alive. On the other hand, there are realities or geopolitical realities of different armies on the Syrian soil, and then economic and political constraints inside Iran. So is that interaction of these two contradictory elements that will decide if Iran and Israel will go into a direct conflict with each other on Syrian soil.
Thank you. Thank you. Jennifer?
Great. Well, I want to thank the Atlanta Council for having me here today. I'm very pleased to join such esteemed colleagues on this panel. I'd like to zoom out and offer some framing points on how I see the trajectory of the Syrian conflict, given actually the internationalization of the conflict that I think was just presented so well to you. The Assad regime has, in fact, thanks predominantly to the military support that Russia and Iran provide, retaken most of Western Syria. However, these gains actually obscure a fundamental rot and instability within regime-held terrain that actually does fundamentally undermine the prospects for, in my view, a negotiated settlement of the war, but also undermines the likelihood that the areas that the regime has now recaptured will now transition into an area of relative stability and reconstruction. Put simply, it is actually very unclear that Assad can hold the areas that he has retaken, both in terms of coordinating between the various local security forces that had been fighting in his name, but also hold that terrain in the face of what will be a long-term jihadist insurgency that will replace, and actually has already to a large degree replaced, what was originally a pro-democracy rebellion against the Assad regime, which has become an international jihad. Al-Qaeda still retains significant combat power in northwestern Syria, as well likely as isolated sleeper cells within recaptured areas. ISIS is also already resurging, and I'm happy to get much more into the details of that assessment in the discussion section. These jihadist groups remain committed to undermining the stabilization of areas recaptured from the Assad regime, and I do believe that they have capability to do so. We've already seen some of the dangerous signs of that capability, to include spectacular attacks in places like Soweto, but also the Syrian coast. The unity of effort that the pro-regime coalition of Russian advisors, Iranian-provided proxy forces, local Syrian militias were able to accomplish in offensive operations may not actually hold and be an effective model for securing the terrain that Assad has recaptured. We are already seeing the signs of local competitions between those various actors for access to local aspects of the economy in places like Aleppo and Abu Kamal. And that contestation over resources and relative influence on local levels is actually, in my view, going to jeopardize the stability of those areas and create opportunities for jihadist groups to exploit. So as we zoom forward and look at the trajectory of this conflict, I think it's actually very important not to assume that all of the gains on the map actually will hold, nor is it feasible to assume that Assad could, even if he was willing to negotiate, necessarily implement deals on the ground if he can't control all of the forces that operate in his name. The same is true for the Russians and the Iranians. So we have a very complex and fractious mix of forces fighting on the ground. That's an aspect of this conflict that doesn't get discussed as often, I think, as it needs to. And it has significant implications for the Iranian strategy and the Iranian requirements on the Syrian battlefield moving forward. Much attention is paid to the Iranian-provided Shia foreign fighter groups that had fought in Assad's name, correctly so. They're a dangerous threat not only to Syria's stability, but also to regional stability, given that Iran is in part training and using them in Syria with intent to deploy them elsewhere. But what we also have is Iranian penetration into ostensibly Syrian units, into Syrian ministries, and all sorts of aspects of the Syrian regime that gets far less attention, but actually is a fundamental threat moving forward, and a fundamental Iranian capability that is very much going to come into play if Assad and his backers are able to get reconstruction aid from the international community. We already see some dangerous signs of international willingness to invest in Assad's reconstruction. We see evidence of Japanese projects, for instance, helping Assad with, I believe, electricity on the Syrian coast, and other initial indicators that some European states might potentially be willing to invest, etc. Iran is positioned to gain access to those funds, not only because it has those military forces deployed, securing terrain in various parts of Syria, but also because of that penetration into the Syrian regime's apparatus. So as the United States and our allies define goals to include the withdrawal or expulsion of Iranian forces inside of Syria, I think it's very important not to define down our understanding of the problem and limit our treatment only to those foreign fighters, because in some respects that's more of a simple, more of an easily identifiable problem on the battlefield. The rot within the Syrian regime is much, much more difficult, and I think requires a very long-term strategy to actually undo that over time. And with that, I'll turn it over.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting, Will. After my two colleagues brought it into discussion from the Iranian angle and from some Syrian playground, I would suggest looking at it from a historical context. Because what we're now watching is just a manifestation of a pretty clear Iranian strategy of proxy war, long-term, which runs parallel to the long journey of Iran to be a nuclear power. And we usually partition those and deal with them separately for policy reasons, for cognitive reasons, for emotional reasons. But it's a good starting point to acknowledge that this is part and parcel of the same strategy. The second thing that comes to mind, that 1979 was a turning point when Israel lost Iran as a strategic partner and won it as its most bitter rival and enemy. And when you take it a bit down the road, you understand that for the last 40 years, most of Israel's conflicts were with Iranian-funded proxies, with some skirmishes on the side, but that's the main thing we're doing since the first IRGC forces landed in Lebanon. So then Hezbollah and Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and other places. And that's something to understand and acknowledge. When you go into the mechanics of this proxy war, you understand the logistics, that there is a process of funding, training, equipping, readying for battle, then attriting Iran's rivals over time, diverting them to look at other places instead of what Iran is doing, and actually keeping Israel busy doing what Iran actually planned it to do. And I don't think that much of a difference is what's happening today in Yemen, because the kingdom of Saudi Arabia is consumed with this never-ending war, highly costly, both on blood, treasure, reputation, and attention. This is, they're exactly not dealing with Iran when they claim that Iran is the number one problem. So I think the important part to understand that Israel was still undergoing a profound learning process of experiencing by friction to fully understand the Iranian threat, in which enemies are built on our borders, then seeking friction, then attriting us, deterring us in some ways, and crippling our freedom of operation around. Now, this system is built not only on strategy and on logistics, but on several rules of the game, which Nader mentioned some of them. And those rules of the game actually call for both sides accepting them. And that means Iran will not seek a direct friction with its enemies. The proxies will fight on its behalf. And at the same time, under the general understanding of international rules or law of armed conflict, they seek to run most of the operations under the threshold of war. So actually employing force against them seems not normative, unjustified. And this dichotomy of war and peace, which is quite imagined and I would say legalistic, lawyeristic, in a way different from how things run in our environment. And even the recent national security strategy of the United States mentioned those gray area challenges of neither war or peace. And I think this is the point where you need to mention the emergence in Israel of the concept of the campaign between the wars. We understand that we need to fight wars once in a while. We understand that war is costly, dangerous, not always bringing you to where you want to be, but this dichotomy of either you're in war or preparing for it doesn't catch what's really happening while you're having all this fun. And this is what came to be known as the campaign between the wars, which is an ongoing campaign actually wanting to avert wars, to delay them as much as possible, to prepare for their best conditions, and to deter our enemies from ever going to wars. And that's the layout that needs to be kept in mind. Syria, since the beginning of the civil war, Israel said, we take no part in intervening on who's ruling Damascus. We are just self-protecting, making sure that Hezbollah doesn't get new weapons or too advanced weapons, and whoever will attack us, we'll go after them. Those who attack, those who host, those who dispatch, everybody along the chain. And the civil war gave Israel this window of doing all this with pretty low cost or risk of deterioration. Now, the last year, or since probably the summer of 2017, I think was the turning point in Iran's strategy. When they say, okay, most of the fighting is over, now it's time to cash the war dividends. We're moving in our bases and military capacities. This is an anti-status quo situation. Iran typically is portraying it as a depth forward. We are going to defend Iran from closer up to Israel. Israel sees it as it is, as trying to build a new threat, very substantial, on its Syrian border, additional to what's already in Lebanon. So Israel here is a status quo actor, and Iran is pushing forward to change it. Several things they didn't take into account. Israel is a learning creature. Iran is also such an actor. There's a lot of thinking on the dynamics. And the other thing they didn't take into account is the overstretch of coming to play in Syria. Close proximity, well-known environment, under acute intel and operational dominance of Israel. When I joined the IDF in 1984, well, Syria was my major. We did Syria since the peace with Egypt broke. Then we did Hezbollah quite obsessively after 2006. And the mixture of those two actually is bringing Iran pretty much to our zone of comfort, so to speak, or superiority. Let's try to understand the Israeli dilemma. Do we sit back watching this grow, finding one day the full-fledged Iranian missile, SAM, air, open frontier in the Golan Heights, saying, well, we're biding our time, and so on? Or we're taking another sort of risk of earlier preemption, of trying to nip it at the bud, of trying to dissuade Iran from fully building it. And I think that's the heart of the dilemma. But Israel 2017-18 is not Israel 2005, because the Lebanon trauma is also well burnt into our psyche. Doing nothing from 2000 to 2006 brought Hezbollah to what it was in 2006. Doing very little since 2006 against Hezbollah brought Hezbollah to the numbers we're now seeing of over 100,000 rockets threatening Israel. So Israel saw the unfolding threat. So I see precision missile effort, the precision project, coming into Syria to equip Hezbollah with better impact capacities, which means every rocket is an impact point, not just a launching effort. It means many more ruined buildings once the war comes. It's dramatic. And the other stuff is actually Iranian capabilities of surface to surface or surface to air in air. And we understand it will cripple the freedom of operation and expand the future threat. So Israel said, we're not waiting for you to build up. We're not waiting for you to attack us, because we never waited for this instead. And we don't stop ourselves by going for the proxies for Hezbollah people in Syria. We actually do not ask people to show their passports before the launch. And so it's the first time when Israel is actually in pretty wide scale going affront an Iranian effort. This took a gradual process. One was Israel approaching both Russia and the US saying, we would like you to stop Iran from digging into Syria. Russia gave some assurances which eventually boiled down to no Iranians and militias in 85 or 100 kilometers from the Israeli border. I am not under the impression that this assurance is worth a lot. And we'll explain more if you wish later. Second is getting to understanding with Russia that we can coexist in the same airspace. And in this case, it's not the armies, it's the air forces. In a way that will not bring us to collision. Then you saw, even in US media, some early photography of Iranian sites. This is an Iranian site, this is an Iranian site. It's, for those who are accustomed to that, it's pretty clear that when you see a slide with suspicious building, which is a non-existent term in English, but it's very well known in Hebrew, so you know the source. After warning, there came some pinpoint strikes. The UAV part was, some people think, oh, Israel was taken by surprise. Just by looking at the sequence, it was a strategic ambush. Like, we saw it coming, we prepared the reaction, we were ready to follow. And the May attack came after a sequence of Iranian attempts to bring more capacities in theater being foiled. And the last of this was fizzled. Now, I don't want to let it be heard as smug or complacency. It's a difficult playground for them. We have better conditions there. I think the ping pong, although it wasn't really a ping pong, it was mostly pong, shows the preponderance, the intel dominance, the strike superiority, the understanding with Russia, which is conveniently doing other stuff while we are doing God's work, and with the tacit backup of the US, saying, yes, we're behind it. After the Ilyushin 20 downing, when Syrians actually killed 15 Russian servicemen, there was this very prompt supply of S-300 surface-to-air missiles to Syria. And many said, okay, that's the end of time and Israel game over in Syria. I think that's premature, because when you read into the actual grammar of what the Russians are doing, yes, they provided it to Syria geographically, but it's in Russian hands. Minister Shoigu said it will take the Syrians 3 months to train, to be ready to prepare or to operate the system. It doesn't mean that they will operate it within 3 months. At least in my analysis, the Russians have at least 354 reasons not to give it to the Syrians to operate, because then they give them the keys to drag them into trouble with the US or with other stuff that they should not be interested doing. So the jury is still out, and I would wait the Netanyahu-Putin meeting to see what comes out. Bottom line, this is a long war. Whoever thought that a few strikes would turn Iran on its heels and they'll go back home to watch TV, that's premature and simplistic. Whoever thought that, oh, if Israel can't boot out every Iranian from Syria, so it's a failure. So I really propose a gray zone understanding that this is a long contest of wills, and it will take time. And even if we won 2 years of lessen the threat in Syria, it's a good achievement. And the bottom line is the main champion of this Iranian campaign is the Quds Force. And we understand that the Quds Force was made to free Jerusalem. But I have good reasons to believe that Jerusalem is more committed to Jerusalem than the Quds Force is for its release. And when you're really committed to where you are and what you're protecting, and you're fighting close to home, the conditions are on your side. Advantageous in this sense. So the tactics always provide a great drama, but this is a long war, and we need to see what happens in 5, 10, 20 years. A lot will rely on the Iran turning nuclear or not, and the efforts to stop that. So the wider picture is indeed wide. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask the very first question, and then please do start putting up your hands, and we'll take note of the order. Iran seems fairly committed, as recently as this Sunday, to staying in Syria and going through the process that they have perfected in Lebanon of the Lebanization of the government there as the conflict continues. There are two hopes that you hear often. One hope is that domestic pressures will force the Iranians to move slower or retreat from this position. The other hope that you hear is that once the fighting is complete, that the Assad regime and their Russian supporters will convince the Iranians to pull out. I guess the question I have for all of you, very briefly, so we can get to the others, is: do you think that the Assad regime and the Russians, even if they wanted the Iranians to go out, do they have the ability to push the Iranians out?
The Assad's strategy and Russians are not the same. They are overlapping interests, but their strategy is not exactly the same. Assad needs Iran more than Russians do to remain in Syria. Russians used Iran as their ground forces to reach their objective to save Assad. Assad needs, in his thinking, he wants to reunite the whole Syria under his leadership. Very difficult task to do. 1/3 of the country is outside his domain, outside his control. 95% of the gas and oil deposited outside his domain. To get to reunite Syria, go back to the old Syria, is a long order, and Assad would need Iranian support to do that. So although they are very much in tune and all on the pro-regime side, but Russians and Syrians have a little bit different interests going on.
Jennifer, Asa, any?
Sure, yeah. I would just add briefly that no, I don't think either Assad nor the Russians have the ability to force an Iranian withdrawal, certainly not without a fight. So they would have to be willing actually to use military force to compel an Iranian withdrawal, which could lead to, an actual internal fight that would, again, create additional opportunity for jihadists to exploit. On the point about domestic pressure, potentially causing an Iranian retreat, I would simply add that this seems to be an optimistic hope. I'm not sure the evidence supports it. Now, that doesn't mean there's no value in trying to constrain Iran's access to the resources that it uses to fight these wars abroad. But if the Iranian regime does in fact view its involvement in Syria as an existential requirement, an existential religious requirement, then it seems difficult to me to actually base an entire strategy on the assumption that we can indirectly cause them to withdraw.
So,
I think they won't leave. They won't be made to leave. It's not an on-off switch, but it's a dimmer. So I think most of the discussion is what they will be allowed to do while they're there. Which capabilities they bring, which authorities they get, what's the level of control over those hybrid forces of embedded Iranians and militias within the Syrian regime. I don't think that Putin and Assad are great types of power sharing. So there is a tension there. Some of those capabilities actually work for their benefit. Some of them are more risky. And it's an ongoing discussion. So
excellent.
It will fluctuate.
Thank you. I think I saw you the first question. We have a microphone over here.
Thank you, Anthony Garrett from Internews. My question has to do going forward in terms of the issue of cybersecurity and cyberwar. And that hasn't come up yet, and very interested to know what this WISE panel has to say about it. Thank you.
Who wants to take that?
Well, cyber is a very important part of any military these days. Actually, most of the militaries in Syria fighting, they have their own independent cyber commands, including the US. So in generally, that's important. Although sitting next to an Israeli general who has been so close to the field, I let him talk to you about the tactics of that.
It's an ongoing thing. Everybody does it. Some people do it better.
Can you explain more?
I'm just going through your address books, so no, seriously, we had the other day this exposure of Hezbollah servers in the Czech Republic within this social media attack on probably Israeli target. It's an ongoing thing since it's a virtual domain. It runs on parallel with both offensive and defensive efforts. Difficult to attribute, difficult to synchronize with things that's happening on the ground. And it's an ongoing war with little to report on because you don't see them kinetics in motion. But check your bank accounts all the time. Might be North Korea.
Yep. Here's a microphone.
Oh, you very interestingly defined Israel as a learning organism. I'm wondering if you can place the 5 armies that are in the field on a spectrum of the degree to which they are learning organisms. And I'm most particularly interested in where the United States would fit on that spectrum.
It's difficult to judge the literal of military action and policy, because you can be tactically supreme, even operationally superb, and then fail to serve the policy or serving a pointless policy. This is part of military history. I think the most dire situation is with the Assad regime. It just failed to hold ground. It took some help of others to dig out of where it dug itself in. I think the Turks have some problems, which are understandable when most of the senior officer cadre are in jail. That happens to military organizations when they're decapitated. Russians are surely learning and experimenting a lot in the field. Iranians are certainly a learning culture, and this is what makes them a worthy opponent to compete against. The US military is so large that you have very fast-moving pieces and slower like the IDF. You have very fast-moving units, and there are those who are always lost. But I know it sounds terrible in civilian eyes. Militaries in contact either learn or lose. So organizations in military contact are usually faster learning than those who are detached and just observing. And all those in the fields are generating knowledge.
I would add to that briefly, if I could, just a two-finger. I think it's an excellent question, and I'd simply like to add from the U.S. perspective that I think the U.S. has made a mistake actually in characterizing the Syrian theater as primarily a counterterrorism lens. And I don't think we are learning the lessons that we need to about the potential shape of great power conflict to come, for which we see the early signs of this kind of Russian innovation and learning from the Iranians and vice versa emerging on the Syrian battlefield. So I think we need to pay much more attention actually to what the developments in Syria can tell us about Russian and Iranian capabilities of the future.
In the back.
Thank you. I'm Namo Abdullah with Rudao Media Network. In about 2 weeks, US sanctions targeting Iran's energy sector will be restored. I just want to know what kind of impact will that have on this rivalry between Iran and Israel in Syria. Do you think it will change Iran's behavior? Thanks.
Iranian political system is very complex. Basically, you have the government who is in charge of running the country, day-to-day basis of the country, and then you have the ideological aspects of it. Very much like Soviet Union, which we had a Soviet government, and then we had the Communist International next to it. Now look at Iranian government and the Shia International, if you will, are next to that. So the sanctions, the economy, very, very key to how the government can continue govern the country or lack of. Doesn't mean that the ideological segments of the Iranian regime under the supreme leader, basically IRGC, Basij Force, and Quds Force outside the country, and judiciary and intelligence, which is under that large umbrella of the revolutionary forces in Iran, doesn't mean that they don't have other resources outside the country. As a matter of fact, the Quds Force itself is organized in a way to outlast even the Islamic Republic. In case if anything should happen to government in Tehran, the Quds Force has enough resources, businesses, Shia militias armed caches in the Middle East and beyond that can survive in some capacity to still serve as the headquarters of the Shia militancy in the Middle East. Doesn't mean that they want to lose Tehran, of course not. Tehran government gets all the oil money, and the oil money is very important for the Quds Force to do. What I'm saying that is not exactly same. That revolutionary trend, that revolutionary strand of the Iranian regime will remain. That's one of the reasons they want to have this arc of Shia influences, and they define it from Afghanistan all the way to Lebanon and Mediterranean. They look at their rule as regional rule more than just the national.
Sir?
Thank you very much. I'm Kawa Khidr from Kurdistan 24. while it's very known, one of the main gates for the flow of the Iranian capacity and the ideological supreme is the way from Iraq to Syria. My question is, don't you think that one of those bigger or more important solutions is having a smarter diplomacy in containing Iraq to prevent or at least to decrease this influence? Thank you.
Sure, I'm happy to start and offer a few thoughts on that. I think it's an excellent question, and I would agree. The Iranians have a strategy. We'll see how successful they are, but they have a strategy to offset the impact of American sanctions, in part by attempting to consolidate their positions within Iraq, especially to consolidate control over profitable ministries within the Iraqi state. We're watching that bid, that Iranian bid to consolidate in Iraq, unfold right now, so it's not a done deal. We've seen the US put leverage on the table actually to try to deter or to prevent some of the worst possible outcomes where the Iranians really do consolidate control of much of Iraqi state institutions. So the Iranians aren't uncontested, and we are watching this Trump administration take some steps that I do think are positive. However, the Iranians are very good at this. They're very committed. And of course, they already have penetrated large elements of the Iraqi state, right? They indirectly control the Interior Ministry, among other things. So I think that what the US does need to do is make sure that our strategy to apply pressure on Iran's economy and Iran domestically by supporting rhetorically the protest movement is matched by a regional strategy actually to block Iran's basically escape hatches economically, to prevent Iran from preying upon the Iraqi state, as well as international aid potentially inside of Syria.
Mm-hmm. Sir? Okay, wait for the microphone.
Sorry, Conway Ziegler from the Middle East Policy Council. The people have been talking about Iranian influence in Syria, but we haven't put some kind of numbers on that. And I'm not sure if that's been going up and down. It may be that it has. But my impression is that what we've got is you've got both some Quds Force elements, which are sort of under direct Iranian control, and then about 8,000 Hezbollah Iranian supported out of Lebanon, and that's sort of the presence level. And it seems to me that Assad, in terms of, you're right, in terms of holding on to the terrain he's recaptured, if the Hezbollah forces withdrew, he would have problems doing that. And based on the U.S. current policy that we're not going to withdraw our troops from Syria until all Iranian folks are gone, are we talking Hezbollah or are we talking just the Quds Force?
Let me start on that. The Quds Force is the main agency, Iranian agency, that control the Iranian involvement in Syria. In Battle of Aleppo alone, there were more than 50,000 Shia militias organized in national-based brigades under the direct command and direct control of the Quds Force commander. So it's not just 8,000 Hezbollah. We are talking about tens of thousands. Even in post-Aleppo, we are looking at numbers closer to 50,000 Shia militias still remaining. These are non-Syrians militias remaining in Syria, organized, led, and financed by the Iranians. So when we say Quds Force, we are not talking about just 2,000, 2,500 officers and general officers they have in Syria, but also this large legion of Shia militias.
Basically Iraqi?
There are Iraqis, there are Pakistanis, there are Afghan, there are Lebanese, and from variety of other nationalities in the Gulf. So Iran has much stronger influence in Syria, and of course then there is a religious Shia and Alawi influences in different parts of the country. More than just military, but also political and cultural.
I would simply add to that, just briefly, if I could, to say that that's a staggering amount, of course, of Iranian influence, and that's before we even get to the Syrian elements that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps has been funding and in some cases training. So we know the IRGC is involved in helping Assad, for instance, recruit tribal forces in eastern Syria in order to help Assad generate some kind of combat capability out there. So what's actually very unclear to me is exactly your question about what the stated US goal actually means. Where are we defining the objective when it comes to getting Iran out of Syria? Because there's a version of that that actually requires the dismantling of much, if not most, of the forces fighting in Assad's name beyond the foreign fighters.
Yeah, well, I think Mike Pompeo didn't have those notes when he went to the Heritage Foundation on the 21st of May.
But Pompeo last week said that the U.S. policy is to have all the Iranian forces out of the country, out of Syria, which corresponds to Israeli policy in Syria. Now, is that a done deal, and or that policy can be changed later? I'm not sure, but that's what the administration is saying these days, that their goal in Syria is to have all Iranian forces out of Syria. As a matter of fact, they've gone one step further. They're saying that US forces will remain in Syria until the Iranians are in Syria. This is a response to Russia asking for all the foreign forces to get out. US is saying that not just the Quds Force, but the Shia militias, all the ballistic missile facilities, UAV facilities, and all other facilities that Iranian Quds Force controls must be out of Syria before US pulls out of the country. That's the latest pronouncement of the policy.
I'm curious for you
microphone.
and the rest of the panel. What do you see as the...
Can you introduce yourself?
Yes. Hi, Eliora Katz from the Brookings Institute. So I'm curious for you, General, and for the rest of the panel. What do you see as the ideal U.S. Policy and strategy in the region to produce the best outcome? And do you see a gap between what you would like the U.S. to do and what they're willing to do?
The best outcome for the Middle East?
Well, what would the U.S. be doing to create the best outcome? Like, what do you want in an ideal world for the U.S. to be doing, and how does that differ from what they're actually doing?
We need to acknowledge that not all that we see in our environment is fixable, and we're working on mitigation. I think a realist cause is bringing as many people alive to the other side, if there is another side, as we can. Now, it's much about commitment and show of commitment, not in a critical or judgmental way, but the US policy is a long list, and the Middle East is falling down this list from understandable reasons. There are a lot of reputational issues on staying power, on wanting to stay and to see it out. I'm not saying it's about fighting in the Middle East. It's about being engaged and wanting to be involved. In Syria, I would say that since the beginning of the civil war, most of what the US did is disowning it and presenting it to Russia to deal with. In some ways, even wishing it good luck in a spiteful way. So it's much about staying, understanding the limitations of what you can achieve and what you can't, counterbalancing Russia in a good way, which plays into a larger US, Russia, even China issues. So I wouldn't go into specifics, and I have very little leniency to advise other governments of where to send their forces. It's everybody with his own kids. Seriously.
Not just forces sanction.
With every employment of force, be that economic, political, or military, you need to ask yourself, what's the connecting transmission from pressure to output? And saying, I'll stay here until the Iranians leave, it's a question of who outweighs whom. And there's this famous saying that the difference between long time and a short time is whether you're standing by the grill or sitting on it. And if staying in Syria means that more pressure will be applied on the US than is actually on Russia, Syria, and Iran, there might be a disconnect between the method chosen and the goal stated. And the goal is specifically undefined, because if you define goals, you need to meet them. If it's more general, politically it's easier to maneuver, and that's the nature of every political military encounter worldwide. Politics are vaguer, and with the military level, you need to see which piece of metal flies where and meets whom. It's very physical and specific. And this literal between abstract and physics is actually the art of war.
Okay, quick two-finger.
When the US says they're going to stay in Syria until Iranians leave, it's not just because of the national interest of the US. US is saying that because it corresponds to the Israelis. They want to support the Israelis. They think that's what Iranians are a major threat to Israel. That's why they want to stay there, not leave. Now, is it possible? I agree with Gerald. That's a tall order. What if Iranians do not leave? Because there's not much stomach in this town to keep any considerable number of US forces in the Middle East, especially in Syria. They're very happy to leave as soon as possible if this Iran element was not there.
Sir?
Yeah, good morning. I'm Bassam Baramendi from Syria. My question about the commitment that you are mentioning about the policy strategy, Iran goes out or stay. We saw a few weeks ago when the Americans threw Daraa under the bus, where the Daraa area, it has the largest FSA group vetted by United States, supported by the West, and with just text message from someone here, they say, guys, good luck. So how we match the policy, strategy, Iranian out, with this incident that the Americans were willing by text message to say to the guys, good luck. Thank you.
Sure, I'll offer some thoughts. I find that to have been an unacceptable decision on the part of the United States. I think we have continued to hemorrhage opportunities inside of Syria because we're not willing to do what is necessary to exploit those opportunities. I think southern Syria was one such example, and I've been arguing that for many years. I think you're identifying a problem, which is that the US has lost credibility if we ever had it inside of Syria. So while I do think that that sets a very dangerous precedent, what we did not do in the South, what we did not do to save Aleppo, the sad reality is that that's actually the status quo of American policy. So I actually would prefer to frame the decision to stay in the East as a turning point, potentially, in how the United States engages with this conflict. Now, it is a turning point that is far too late. We've allowed the situation to get far too dire. Quite frankly, we decided to stay, in my view, for the wrong local partner, which I think sends a bad message. The fact that when we finally get some willpower to defend something in Syria, we're doing that with a military force aligned with the PKK. However, we decided to stay. I give the Trump administration credit for that. It was not an easy decision. I think the US now has a lot to prove about our resolve, if challenged, actually to protect the partners and the Syrian terrain we've decided to claim. I think both the Russians and the Iranians intend to test our resolve, and I sure hope this administration is serious, actually, about doing what is necessary to retain American influence locally and to rebuild America's image within this theater, because I think it's absolutely critical that we do so in order actually to avoid some of the most dangerous outcomes that are still possible within this theater, which include a direct threat to Israel, but also include more dangerous regional conflagrations of violence if the Iranians are allowed to continue what they're doing and the Russians are allowed to continue what they're doing. And if the United States is not in a position actually to prevent the return of a barbaric enemy like ISIS, which actually is a very real threat here and now.
In the back.
Yes, David Abramson from the State Department. My question is about Russia and the question of its inability to get Iran out of Syria aside. What are the expectations and the confidence levels of Israel, Iran, and the Assad regime for Russia's future role in the region moving forward?
Iranians are very concerned about Russia. Russia, after the defeat of the Sunni opposition and relative stability of Assad in Damascus, at least. When Israelis attack Iranian positions in Syria, Russians had, of course, S-400 anti-aircraft missiles available to them to challenge Israeli attack over on Iranian positions. That never happened because for the real fact that Russia does not see itself as an enemy of Israel. Iran does, and Iranians were very surprised that the Russians did not. The Russians basically turned off the S-400, simply put. Now the S-300 they're giving to the Syrians is more of a symbolic and propaganda way from the point of view of Iranians. The S-300s are old system, 1970s. Actually, Syrian military had more advanced anti-aircraft, Russian anti-aircraft missile systems like SA-17 than the S-300. S-300 is just becoming a very big name. So Iranians do not see that as a major contribution from Russia to the Syrian air defense. And General was right that even that the Russians are going to operate that, if the recent history shows, at least for 2 more years, under the guise of training the local Syrians to do that. So yes, there is that. Definitely Iranians are not counting on Russia to go all the way in alignment with their policy. Of course, Russia doesn't want, I agree with my both colleagues that Russia does not really want to push Iran all the way out of Syria. They cannot. Even if they could, they don't want that because Iran's presence has a value for Russia. But that doesn't mean that Iranians are satisfied and count on Russia's support on the way forward.
Okay.
I think Israel understands that Russia is in Syria to stay. So it's a military neighbor. Better not turn into a military rival. Whoever misses that point, better ask Turkey. So pretty early on, we went on strategic understanding and deconfliction measures. I think it explains much of the leeway that we enjoyed operating in Syria. At the same time, with our eyes wide open, we're not on the same page with Iran, which is a Russian partner, if not ally, if the Russians have alliances. And we're definitely not on the same page when Russia's main goal is to make America small again. When so much of Israel's strategic posture is built on the fact that the US posture is strong, and in the Middle East seen as strong. We're a small creature casting a long shadow because we stand near the light. And it's not just the light from Jerusalem, it's much from this place. So I think a clear-eyed, we had some columnists already writing that Russia has exposed herself as an enemy of Israel. Since Ben-Gurion, we're trying not to play head-to-head with superpowers, at least militarily. And it will be good to keep very close speaking terms, although it will never be as intimate, close, and value-based as we have in this town.
Mm-hmm. Sir?
Good morning. I'm Matthew Parrish from the Department of Defense. You all have mentioned great power competition and operating in the gray zone. So what do you see as Iran's critical vulnerabilities where the U.S. can apply pressure moving forward?
For Israel's great revelation is when you take the Quds Force heads on, it matters to the system because it's a key component to the strategy of proxy war. In your permissions and authorities currently, you're meaning to stay in Syria to make them leave, but not acting against them to make them leave. This is also relevant for the land bridge or the logistic line going east to west. So I think the hidden in plain sight is that everybody are keeping off Quds Force toes, except on the financial and political side, when it's actually the key wheel in this clockwork. And they should be treated as what they are. They're a terror-generating enterprise. And when we had our talks in the IDF in the early years of the war, what should we prefer? You know, ISIS or Quds Force and Iranian? Well, we wish them both success in killing each other, but we actually need to fight them both as if the other isn't there. And I think that's a revisit that is worthy.
As long as the Iranians change their policy, change their strategy from the gray zone involvement into direct conflict, direct action against Israel, they're setting up themselves, exposing their personnel, exposing their material, their equipment to Israeli attacks. And if they do not make any drastic changes in a very near future, like probably moving some of their personnel equipment to areas closer to Lebanese and Iraqi borders, or even into Lebanon, making changes not to be such an easy targets for the Israeli attacks, because as I said, that S-300 is not going to help much. Before that, especially if it is manned by the Russians, before that SA-17 did not help, and Israel destroyed some of those systems. So that's the weak point of of Iran that's changing the strategy in a sense, disregarding their own doctrine of asymmetric proxy warfare. If they continue doing that, they're going to expose themselves to Israeli attacks and indirectly to U.S. would like to see that.
I would agree. Yeah, I would agree with the general that I think the extremism of the Iranian regime is a vulnerability. The Iranians don't, from what I understand, intend to be a Shia sectarian actor across the wider Middle East. In fact, this regime intends to, represent the entire Islamic community. However, the effect that the Iranians actually generate is to drive sectarianism. That is a vulnerability. And I wish that the US would exploit that more often to build centers of the middle, of moderate local populations that don't wish to be pulled in either direction towards the Iranian version of extremism or the Salafi jihadist version of extremism. I think that there's a vulnerability there that we can start exploiting if we're willing to engage on local levels to an extent that would actually posture us to create that kind of an effect.
And as an afterthought, it's not the Iranian vulnerability. We know our enemy. Now let's know ourselves. Our acceptance of their rules of the game and not calling them for what they are is part of their success. So when they're plotting to assassinate somebody in Cafe Milan, when they're shooting rockets by proxy on your consulate in Basra, when they're hurling missiles on Kurdish and IS targets near US forces in Syria, and when they're responsible for, I think, the larger part of your casualties by IED, by proxy during those years, hundreds of US lives, hundreds. And I don't think they ever got the bill. So in this sense, and Yemen, by the way, most of the Yemen discourse I hear is about telling Saudi Arabia to do it differently. How about disconnecting the supply cord, feeding the Houthi war effort? What's that supply cord? It's Quds Force. So I think we're, walking around the bush like Winnie the Pooh and Piglet. We know what it is. It's Quds Force.
Well, unfortunately, we have a lot more questions, but I think we're going to have to end with the Winnie the Pooh reference. Thank you very much for everyone. This has been a very enjoyable discussion. Thank you.